Winters in Minnesota during 1868 showed no mercy for anyone who slipped up. Frost draped over the pines like thin white cloth. The morning Lars Nyberg began hauling his first logs out of the Minnesota woods. The forest was quiet, the kind of cold silence that makes every sound echo twice. His boots crunched through the thin crust of snow as he dragged the dark, bark-covered timber toward the clearing where his neighbors watched from a distance. They had expected clean, pale logs, peeled, shaved, neatly stacked like the drawings in the government manuals. Instead, Lars hauled in trees still wearing their rough skin, mottled with moss and old scars. The men exchanged glances. One muttered something that drifted across the frost. "Lazy," someone whispered. A row of peeled logs gleaming like bones in the weak winter sun. John Cartwright stood proudly beside them, draw knife still in hand, his sleeves rolled at the elbow. He had spent days removing every inch of bark, convinced that smooth wood meant safety. It was the rule. Everyone followed. The rule everyone trusted. Lars didn't even glance at those polished timbers. He swung his sled around and unloaded another dark log, bark still thick, rough and wet with frozen sap. Cartwright's brow tightened. "Does he not know?" someone asked. "Or does he just not care?" another replied. The frontier made people suspicious of anyone who didn't suffer the same way they did. Hard work was a badge of honor. Pain was proof of character. And a man who skipped peeling was either a fool or a threat to the order they clung to. Lars stood alone in the clearing, sacking his rough logs without ceremony. He worked with a quiet rhythm, never explaining himself, never defending his choices. A stranger from colder lands, a man with an accent from somewhere across the ocean, choosing to ignore the frontier's sacred instruction. The bark must come off. A sound like a pistol shot echoed through the forest. One of Cartwright's peeled logs had split under the sudden exposure, the fresh wood reacting violently to the frigid air. The men looked at it but said nothing. The tension in the clearing grew heavier than the winter sky. Why would a man choose methods that every manual warned against? Why risk rot? Why risk humiliation? The wind rolled down from the north, carrying a sharper cold. Lars paused, feeling the air brush across the bark of his logs. He pressed a hand to the coarse surface as if listening to it. Something in his expression flickered. Calm certainty, almost a quiet satisfaction. Not many noticed, but those who didn't understand it. Cartwright walked over, draw knife hanging from his fingers. "You planning to leave the bark on?" he asked, half mocking, half genuinely confused. Lars nodded once. "That's how it stands," he said. A laugh broke from somewhere behind Cartwright. "That cabin won't last 3 winters." A voice jeered. Another added, "Won't even last 1 thaw." Lars didn't answer. He simply turned back to his work and kept stacking the rough timber, building the walls of a cabin that everyone else already believed was doomed. A simple foundation of stones, frost gathering along their edges, piles of barked logs waiting, dark and stubborn. Above them all, the clouds thickened, an early warning of the brutal season that would test every man, every method, every wall. The valley was preparing to judge them all. Spring arrived like a slow unraveling, snow melting into muddy trenches, warm winds peeling away the quiet of winter. Settlers stepped out of their cabins expecting relief, only to hear the first unsettling groans of wood under stress. Timber they had carefully peeled months earlier now twisted, warped and cracked under the confused dance of thaw and moisture. One of Cartwright's logs split down its length, a deep fissure blooming across the exposed heartwood. Inside his cabin, thin streams of cold air slid through gaps the mortar couldn't fill. A faint smell of damp rot lingered in the corners, an odor everyone feared. Cartwright pressed a hand against the new crack, feeling the moist grain within. The manuals had promised protection. Peel the bark, expose the sapwood, let the timber dry quickly. But drying wasn't what had happened. It had torn itself open. Lars Nyberg knelt beside his own cabin, palm gliding across the untouched bark. The surface was uneven, chipped, scarred, but intact and dry. Water from the thaw slid along its ridges, trickling harmlessly to the earth below. No cracking. No rot. No cold seeping through. Cartwright watched from several yards away, irritation simmering into unease. Frontier diagrams of proper log construction. Smooth timber, bright surfaces, perfect lines. The very manuals that settlers trusted. But none of those diagrams showed what Minnesota's spring rains truly did. Across the settlement, frustration grew. Peeled logs split as the outer layers dried too fast, pulling away from the damp interior. Those deep checks became traps, channels where water pooled, soaked, and stayed. Warm days followed by cold nights forced moisture that deeper, making the logs swell, then shrink, then rupture again. In some cabins, the bottom logs, always closest to mud and splashing rain, turned dark and soft to the touch. When a finger pressed into the wood, it sank slightly. Fear spread faster than the thought. A settler named Morgan crouched beside his corner notch, the exposed grain, pale and thirsty. Sucked in spring water like a sponge, he scraped the decayed fibers away with a knife, watching them crumble like wet paper. "This isn't right," he muttered. Neighbors gathered, whispering the same words over and over. "But the manual said." "But we peeled them clean." "But that's how it's supposed to be done." Lars walked by without stopping. He carried a small hatchet and a length of rope, heading toward the woods as if none of the panic around him existed. A few of the settlers followed him with their eyes, resentment blending with a new, quieter emotion. Doubt. Rain misted across the valley, beating on the bark of Lars's cabin, before sliding away. On Cartwright's peeled logs, the droplets clung, then sank into the open grain. "Why isn't it cracking?" someone whispered. "Because it's still got that cursed skin on it," another answered. "Yeah, but why does it work?" That was the question no one wanted to say aloud. Lars stacking tools near his cabin, the ground beneath his walls dry and firm. He didn't explain his methods. He didn't argue. He simply observed the world the way his ancestors had taught him, through seasons, storms, and survival, not manuals. The valley stretched under a gray sky. Cabins that looked perfect in winter now sagged and groaned. Every gust of wind whistled through widening checks. Every rainfall threatened rot. And yet one cabin, dark, rough, strange, stood solid. No cracks, no soft corners, no breath of cold leaking through. The men, who had laughed now, watched silently. Something in their world wasn't adding up. They needed an explanation, but what they would find was far stranger, deeper, and older than any frontier guidebook had ever prepared them for. Winter settled over the Minnesota woods like a heavy, unbroken sentence. The cold wasn't just temperature. It was pressure, weight, a force that reached into every living thing and commanded silence. Trees stood rigid, their sap frozen deep in their cores. The air itself glittered with frost. This was when most settlers huddled inside, burning through wood piles to keep children warm. But Lars Nyberg stepped into the forest with an axe over his shoulder, moving through the waist-deep snow with the calm purpose of someone waiting for this exact moment. His boot pressed into the powder, sinking with a soft crunch. He placed a gloved hand on a pine trunk. The bark felt tighter now, stiff, almost fused to the wood beneath. The forest in winter had a different texture, a different logic. Where others saw danger, he saw readiness. Cartwright watching from the tree line, breath fogging in the frigid air. "Cutting trees now?" he muttered. "Freezing your hands off for nothing." But it wasn't nothing. Lars swung his axe and the steel bit into the trunk with a thick, muted thud. No sap spray, no squishy cambium layer. The frozen fibers split cleanly. He worked methodically, his movements smooth despite the cold. No draw knife, no stripping. The bark stayed exactly where nature had glued it. As the tree fell, the impact sent a plume of powder rising like smoke. Lars knelt beside the freshly cut log and examined the bark edge. It clung tight, bonded by the winter freeze, not loose, not sliding, not prone to peeling like in summer. This was a secret no Manu had written. Winter glued the coat to the tree. Lars brushed frost from the surface, exposing the chaotic, uneven mosaic of bark. Thick ridges, tiny valleys, pockets of air sealed inside. A layer that nature had spent decades engineering to withstand storms, cold, heat, insects, and rot. To settlers, bark was waste. To Lars, it was insulation, armor, 1,000 tiny air pockets acting as a thermal shield. And winter harvesting locked that armor in place. Back at the settlement, peeled log cabins suffered in ways their builders had never anticipated. Cold sank through the dense wood like water through cloth. Even with fires raging, the inside walls were freezing to the touch. Warm air rose, chilled, and fell in a constant draft that stole sleep and strength. Families woke to frost on their blankets. Lars's cabin? The walls radiated a quiet stillness. No drafts. No ice crystals forming along the chinking. The bark's air pocket layer slowed the cold, so much that the interior stayed calm. Still air. Warm air. Restful air. Another peeled log opened with a violent snap in someone else's cabin. The noise echoed across the valley. Cartwright flinched. "Why doesn't his split like that?" a neighbor asked. Cartwright pressed his lips together. "It will," he insisted. But he didn't sound convinced. Lars pulling another winter-felled log toward his clearing. His breath rose in steady clouds. Snowflakes clung to his beard. Despite the cold, he looked at peace. Scandinavian timbermen in deep winter, axes resting on their shoulders, felled trees with bark intact, techniques older than the frontier itself. In Norway, Sweden, Finland, the cold wasn't an enemy. It was an ally. It made the material better, stronger, warmer. And Lars had brought that knowledge with him, unseen and unappreciated. A storm gathered on the horizon, slow at first, then faster, the wind sharpening. The settlers braced for another night of relentless cold. Most chopped wood until their hands ached, piling fuel inside to survive the long, bitter hours. Lars carried half the amount they did. He knew he wouldn't need more. But the others didn't know why. Not yet. Spring did not arrive gently that year. It came fast, wet and heavy, rains pounding the thawing earth until the settlement sagged under mud and dripping eaves. Cabins that had survived winter began to show new weaknesses, peeling corners, softening logs, mold creeping along grain left exposed. The valley smelled of wet earth and quiet worry. Cartwright kneeling beside his sill logs, scraping away a gray, pulpy layer with his knife. The wood came off too easily, flaking like rotten bark. "This ain't right," he muttered. Behind him, neighbors stood in a tense silence. They had all peeled their logs. They had all done the proper thing. Yet their cabins were dying from the bottom up. Across the rain-soaked clearing, a column of smoke twisted into the air. Lars Nyberg stood beside a large iron kettle suspended over a fire. Beside the pot, something thick and dark bubbled like tar. The smell drifted through the rain, sharp, resinous, almost medicinal. Neighbors approached, drawn by curiosity and unease. "What in God's name is he cooking?" someone whispered. Lars stirred the boiling mixture with a wooden paddle, lifting a ribbon of black pitch that stretched like molten glass. He added a ladle of rendered tallow, animal fat he had melted the day before. The mixture crackled, softened, grew flexible. It wasn't just sap, it was armor. Nyberg's motion was deliberate, practiced, something he'd done many times long before he ever set foot on American soil. He lifted the kettle, carried it to the corner of his cabin, and began painting the pitch mixture onto the exposed log ends. The boiling resin soaked into the thirsty wood, sealing it instantly. Rain slid off its surface, repelled like water off wax. Cartwright watched from a distance, jaw tightening with something halfway between offense and fear. "That smells unnatural," a man near him muttered. Lars didn't respond. He coated every log end, every vulnerable surface, working in silence as the rain tapped against his shoulders. A memory in motion. Ottawa builders applying birch pitch to storage caches. Scandinavian shipwrights sealing planks with pine tar to survive North Sea storms. Two traditions, born worlds apart, arriving at the same truth. If a tree bleeds resin, it's for a reason. Hardened amber resin clinging to a wounded pine, glistening like frozen honey. Lars had spent the previous autumn collecting it, wounding certain trees intentionally, returning weeks later to harvest gloves of hardened pitch. Settlers thought it pointless. They didn't understand its purpose, but the pitch he boiled today would decide whose cabins survived spring and whose collapsed into the mud. Rain hammered the valley. Water splashed from eaves and pooled around foundation stones. In peeled log cabins, moisture wicked deep into exposed grain. Inside those homes, children coughed from the heavy, damp air. In Lars's home, dry walls, dry corners, a faint, comforting scent of pine tar, warming near the stove. The pitch had sealed every pore water tried to enter. A settler approached Lars at last. "You trying to make the place smell like a boat?" he asked gruffly. Lars smiled faintly. "A warm boat," he said. Another crack of thunder rolled across the sky, shaking loose droplets from the pines overhead. The settlers didn't know it, but they were watching the frontier's future take shape in the rain. There's a kind of wisdom the manuals never wrote down. Wisdom carried in storms, wood fibers, and the quiet choices of those who watch the land instead of commanding it. If stories like this stir something in you, follow winds of thought and stay close. More forgotten frontier truths rise with every telling. Summer returned to the valley with a gentler hand. Grass pushed through old snowmelt, and birds stitched the sky with sound. But beneath that warmth, another, quieter challenge waited. One the settlers didn't yet understand. Heat, wind, sun, orientation. Most frontier cabins faced the same direction, straight along the survey grid. Proud, square, obedient to the map. Doors to the south, windows to the west. Neat rows, neat shadows. But the land didn't move in squares, and neither did the weather. Lars Nyberg, standing in his clearing, staring not at his cabin, but at the horizon. He squinted against the early morning light, watching where the sun slid across the sky. He dragged a stick through the dirt, drawing angled lines, adjusting, erasing, redrawing. Cartwright watched him from the fence line, arms folded. "What's he doing now?" "Trying to summon something," another muttered. But Lars was simply reading the wind. The northwest winds came hard through this valley, sharp, relentless, carrying the cold of 1,000 miles of plains. They slammed into cabins the lines square to their force, pushing cold through chinks, rattling doors, funneling drafts straight into living rooms. Lars brushed soil from his hands and looked up at his own cabin. His strange orientation, twisted off the survey line by degrees, wasn't an accident. He had angled the long wall southeast, not to defy the map, but to obey the sun. In the deep winter months, the sun skimmed low on the southern horizon. By tilting the broad face of his cabin toward that arc, Lars allowed every bit of daylight, and every fragment of heat, to soak into the walls. The bark, with its tiny pockets of air and ridged surface, caught that warmth and held it. Meanwhile, the northern wall, short, low, windowless, cut the wind like a blunt shield. It was geometry. It was weather. It was survival. Settlers didn't see it, but nature respected it. The next innovation, the roof. Frontier cabins usually had short eaves, 6 inches, maybe 8. Wood was precious. Overhangs were wasteful. But that small shadow exposed the log walls to everything the sky threw. Rain, snowmelt, hail-dale, wind-driven slush. Lars extended his eaves 3 full feet. The roof stretched out like the brim of a great hat, shading the entire structure in summer and shedding storms far from the base in winter. When thunderstorms rolled through, rainwater struck the earth well beyond the sill logs, preventing splash rot and giving the base of his home a dry perimeter. Cartwright squinted up at the long overhangs. "Looks ridiculous," he muttered. "Looks like he wasted half the forest on roofing." But that waste saved the home. In summer, the deep eaves blocked direct sunlight from overheating the cabin's interior. In winter, when the sun slanted low, the light reached under the overhang and warmed the barked walls. The system worked with the seasons, not against them. Then came the detail that baffled them most: the extra door. Lars built a small enclosed vestibule on the south-facing side, a short, narrow chamber attached to the main entrance. "What's that little box for?" settlers asked, sneering. "Keeping ghosts from slipping in?" But when winter returned, the truth became undeniable. Lars stepped into the vestibule, closed the outer door behind him, stopped snow from his boots, and then opened the inner door to the warm room. A thermal airlock, a frontier heat trap, a buffer zone that prevented warm air from fleeing with every entry. It was the same principle used by Nordic farmsteads and indigenous winter lodges across the Great Lakes. One more oddity that worked: the valley shimmered with late summer light. Every cabin cast neat shadows along the cardinal grid, except one, whose angled walls, deep eaves, and extra doorway made it look almost foreign. Some settlers laughed, some mocked, but others watched more carefully now, because every strange choice Lars had made so far, unpeeled logs, winter harvesting, pitch sealing, had proven itself stronger, warmer, and smarter than the old ways. And the season they dreaded most was coming again. The season that judged every home. The season that revealed every weakness. The wind was changing. And soon, the sky would too. The first warning was the color of the sky, an iron blue curtain pressing down on the horizon. Winds sharpened by the hour, cutting through the valley in long, violent sweeps. By nightfall, the first flakes of snow arrived. Slow at first, drifting sideways like ash. Then more, then faster. The settlers had seen storms before, but this one felt different. Like something old, powerful, and merciless had awakened over the plains. Inside Cartwright's cabin, the fire roared as he shoved log after log into the stove. The walls already felt cold, the air already restless. His wife wrapped blankets around the children, trying to stop their teeth from chattering. Then the storm hit in full. A white fury swallowed the valley. Snow whipping sideways, wind screaming against the walls, drifts rising like living things. Roofs groaned beneath the weight. The world beyond the window vanished in a single breath. It was as if the storm had erased the boundary between earth and sky. Lars Newberg, stepping into his vestibule, pulling the outer door closed against the wind. Snow blasted the exterior walls, but none entered. He shook frost from his coat and opened the inner door, warm air settling around him like a blanket. The calm inside his cabin contrasted sharply with the violence outside. Flames danced quietly in the stove. The walls held their heat. The barked logs sat unmoved, untouched by drafts, cold, but not frozen, steady as stone. The cabin breathed like a living thing, Cartwright's home. The storm forced the weakness of the peeled logs into the open. The corner notches, softened by rot and moisture from past seasons, began to compress under the crushing weight of nearly 30 inches of snow. As the logs shifted, the mortar between them popped out like teeth breaking loose. Cold air roared through the widening gaps. Mary Cartwright screamed as powdery snow burst through the wall, drifting across the floorboards. The children huddled near the stove, crying as the temperature plummeted. Cartwright grabbed anything he could find, blankets, coats, cloth, to shove into the cracks. The wind tore them out. The storm swallowed them. The cabin was coming apart one handful at a time. A candle flame bent sideways, struggling against the draft. The walls moaned under pressure. The roof creaked with a deep, threatening warning. The settlers had built, according to the book. But the storm did not care. Across the blinding white field, the Nyberg cabin stood buried to its windowsills, the roof heavy with snow. But the barked walls didn't melt the drifts. The snow stayed frozen, clinging tight, becoming a second skin of insulation wrapped around the cabin. Inside, the air remained still, warm, protected. Lars checked the corners. No cracks, no drafts, no movement at all. His logs, untouched by moisture, retained their full strength. The bark thermal barrier held the cold at bay. The deep roof eaves prevented ice buildup along the base, and the orientation of the cabin, angled against the wind, split the storm around it like water, parting against a hull. It wasn't just surviving. It was thriving. Cartwright's cabin, Cartwright's family burned through their stacked wood in a single day, far too fast. The storm was too violent to reach the woodpile outside. The wind would kill them before they reached the shed. Desperation tightened Cartwright's chest. "We'll have to break the chairs," Mary whispered. He didn't argue. One by one, their furniture became firewood. First the stools, then a table leg, then the headboard from their bed. Still the cold crept in. Sweat froze on Cartwright's brow as he worked. His hands cracked and bled. His breath came out in ragged bursts. Lars placing 2 logs gently into his stove. That was all he needed. The barked walls held the heat. The vestibule trapped it. The pitch-sealed ends prevented any moisture from freezing inside, and the angled cabin avoided the worst of the wind's fury. He sat on a wooden stool, listening to the storm rage outside, his family resting peacefully. The fire burned slow, steady, efficient. His woodpile would last days. Cartwright's lasted hours. By the 3rd night of the storm, the Cartwright cabin was nearly lost. Snow blew in through every gap. The stove flickered weakly, its fuel nearly gone. Frost covered the walls inside. The children were pale and still. Cartwright looked toward the window, squinting through swirling white. Somewhere out there was the one man he had mocked more than anyone. With the last of his strength, he wrapped his family in blankets, shoved the door open against the drifts, and stepped into the deadly cold. He staggered through the storm, half blinded, half frozen, until a faint lantern glow appeared through the blizzard. The Nyberg cabin. Lars opened the door before Cartwright even knocked, pulling the shivering man inside with a single motion. Behind him, Mary and the children stumbled in, collapsing into the warmth. Cartwright didn't speak. He didn't need to. The truth had arrived with the storm. When the storm at last broke, the world lay in a hush of white silence. Snowdrifts leaned against cabins like frozen waves. Smoke rose from only a handful of chimneys, thin, uncertain, weak. The settlement looked bruised, humbled, half broken. Cartwright stepped out of the Nyberg cabin wrapped in borrowed blankets, blinking at the gray morning light. His own home, his proud, perfect, peeled log home, wore a crown of collapsed snow. One corner had sunk inward, the doorframe twisted, the chinking blown apart. It was standing, but only in the way a wounded animal stands. Cartwright's jaw tightened. The shame in his eyes was sharp, but so was something else, understanding. Nearby settlers emerged slowly, surveying the damage to their own homes. Broken corners, soft logs, rot pulled up from the thawing ground. A few cabins leaned so far off balance that they looked ready to fall with the next strong breeze, and across the clearing stood the dark, rough, barkskin hayabatak, a rough, bark-skinned cabin. Snow still hugged its walls like a protective shell. The roofline held straight. The foundation stones stood dry. Even the pitch-sealed corners gleamed faintly where sunlight touched them. Not a crack, not a shift, not a single sign of surrender. Over the next days, conversations whispered across the settlement. Soft, embarrassed, but urgent. How did he survive? Why was it warmer? Why didn't his walls crack? Why didn't his roof sag? And the hardest question of all, what else have we been doing wrong? Elder O'Keefe, the indigenous builder who'd long understood these principles, watched with a knowing calm. He recognized Lars's methods as echoes of the old ways the settlers had ignored in their rush to follow manuals printed far from this land. One morning, Cartwright walked toward Lars's cabin with slow, heavy steps. Lars was splitting kindling beside the vestibule, the airlock that had saved his precious heat all winter. Cartwright cleared his throat. That pitch, that bark, that winter cutting, that angle, even that little room. You knew the whole time? Lars rested his axe against his leg. I knew what the seasons taught, he replied gently. Cartwright swallowed hard. Teach us, he said. And the valley changed in that moment. Spring brought not just thawing earth, but real rebuilding. Under Lars's guidance and Elder O'Keefe's wisdom, Settlers began jacking up their cabins to reseal the rotted sills with pitch. New outbuildings rose with bark intact, winter-felled logs, deep eaves, and southern orientation. The airlock entryway, mocked as a little box, became a common sight on new structures. Settlers once obsessed with perfect peeled, civilized-looking logs now dragged home timber covered in moss, lichen, and hardened winter bark. They no longer laughed at the rough exterior. They admired it. They no longer doubted pitch. They boiled their own. They no longer trusted manuals. They hung over the land. They listened to the land instead. Little by little, the valley looked less like a diagram and more like a place built for survival. Decades passed. The early cabins, those first peeled log structures, collapsed into heaps of soft, gray rot. Grass grew over them. Their shapes vanished. But the barked log cabins, they remained. Some leaned, some sank a little. Some were patched with new bark or pitch. But they stood, sound, stubborn, weathered, alive, long after their builders were gone. One day, a historian visiting the region wrote in his notes, "It is curious. The roughest cabins lasted the longest." He didn't know Lars Nyberg. He didn't know the storm of these 73. He didn't know the humiliation, the whispers, the stubbornness, the quiet brilliance. But the walls knew. The wood knew. The valley knew. Sometimes the lessons that matter most are the ones handed down by storms, by bark, by wind, by those who dared to see differently. If you want more stories like this, stories carried by weather, craft, and courage, stay close to Winds of Thought. The frontier still has 1,000 secrets waiting to be told.